All right, so Adam is here because there's a lot I want to go over. So I very much, shocking to, that's why I put this in my bio. I enjoy other sports. I enjoy handicapping other sports, and I enjoy, betting baseball. And I like betting baseball because there's so many numbers to it, and there's so many things that you can dive into. So I wanted you here today to go through a lot of this stuff, and also to kind of check my own process because I'd like to learn and get a little bit better as a handicapper. So kind of the way I'm going to approach this is kind of walking you through like the way that I do it and kind of learning from there, and you can critique and we'll go from there. So essentially, how I start any handicap for a game is with the pitchers. I think that's pretty obvious, right? You start with handicapping the pitchers, and when you open up one of my favorite sites, Fangraphs, you can see a whole bunch of stuff for pitchers, but I've broken it down to the main categories, which are the classic ERA, expected ERA, which is a new one, FIP, fielding independent pitching, and expected fielding independent pitching. First question I have for you before we get to the advanced numbers is, how irrelevant is ERA at this point for handicappers?
Yeah, look, ERA is a very flawed statistic, right? There are a lot of things that come into play with an ERA that, aren't really necessarily in a pitcher's control. For example, the defense. If the defense is bad behind a pitcher, he's probably going to have a high ERA. It doesn't matter what he does. It's just that balls in play are going to fall. They're going to find holes. Fielders aren't going to make plays, so on and so forth. So, ERA is also dependent on context, right? So if you give up a hit with nobody on base, it doesn't really matter. If you give up a hit with two guys in scoring position, it really matters. So ERA doesn't really take into account defense, doesn't take into account luck, doesn't take into account timing. With that being said, if you've got a really bad ERA, it's more than just bad luck. It's probably bad pitching too. But a lot of times you'll see guys with low ERAs that have gotten very, very lucky in a lot of ways. Yep. And those are areas where I typically look for pitchers to regress. And I like to fade a lot of those guys that have really low ERAs, but a lot of their other peripheral stats don't look as good.
So, and for me, one of the processes that I would use is, ERA is relevant to the point where I'll look at the ERA, kind of what you're talking about, high or low, and see what the difference is between my original process was expected fielding independent or XFIP. So for those who are watching, and you guys did this on Runline, by the way, the first episode was awesome, defining a lot of these stats. For people who don't know, definitions for both fielding independent and expected fielding independent FIP, or fielding independent pitching, measures what a player's ERA would look like over a given period of time if the pitcher would have experienced league average results on balls in play and league average timing. These definitions are courtesy of Fangraphs. Now, expected fielding independent, if we could throw that up there, and that's one I used to use, but we're going to get to why not maybe in a moment. But expected fielding independent, a little difference. A regressed version of FIP calculated the same way, except it replaces a pitcher's home run total with an estimate of how many home runs they should have allowed given the number of fly balls they surrendered, while assuming a league average home run to fly ball percentage. That last bit is important for expected fielding independent. As you and I were texting a couple of days ago, that could get kind of noisy, right?
Right, absolutely. And just to clarify, the four components of FIP are strikeouts, walks, home runs, and hit by pitches. So the idea behind FIP is that it's things a pitcher can control. You throw a really bad pitch, it gets hit out of the ballpark. That's your problem. That had nothing to do with the defense. You can't field a ball that goes over the fence, right? Strikeouts, walks, same thing with hit by pitches. So that's where FIP comes in. It's sort of more of an indicator of a pitcher's true talent level in a lot of ways. The thing about XFIP, as you mentioned, it assumes a league average home run to fly ball percentage. Now, some guys just simply won't have that. An extreme ground ball guy is going to have a high home run to fly ball percentage because he doesn't induce a lot of fly balls. On the flip side, a guy with a high fly ball percentage, like take a Justin Verlander, for example, a lot of fly balls, right? He'll give up home runs, but because he has a large sample size of fly balls, his home run to fly ball percentage is typically going to be a little bit lower. So it can be useful, but you have to apply the right level of context where ground ball guys, they won't have a league average home run to fly ball percentage because their fly ball percentage is so low. So you have to apply different layers of context to that. And if you're able to do that, the stat still has relevancy. You just have to be willing to take it another step or two.
Okay, so for the first step when looking at this, as I mentioned, ERA to looking at the differences and all that stuff. And I have an example for you, and it's one that I actually asked you about before we came on the air here. My eyes immediately went to Overton today, who's pitching for Cincinnati. If you look at it first glance, $1.59 ERA, looks like a guy who's worth backing if you give like a periphery glance, like, hey man, he's the Reds' best dude. And in fact, we're going to talk about another Reds pitcher who might be their best dude who has a terrible ERA. But he looks like a guy that's worth backing. But if you look at some of the other numbers, fielding independent, almost 2 runs higher at 3.22. Expected ERA, which I want to ask you about, but we'll get to that in a moment, 4.95. And then you look at context, because you've said that, context, look for context. Then you realize that, well, he's got pretty lucky on balls in play, 250. League average is what, 300? About there?
League average this year for batting average and balls in play is about 283,
Okay.
but it's usually in the 290s,
Okay.
which is something else we can elaborate on.
And it's led to a low whip despite an average rate of walks or below average rate of walks. 9.7 walk rate for Overton, 318 walks per 9. And I was like, well, playing against him might be a spot because he might be a little overvalued by the betting market. And you get Plesac on the other side, and he stinks. Like his numbers across the board are awful. And then lo and behold, what happens? Cleveland up from $1.50 open to $1.65, and the total's up as well.
Right. So one of the things about looking at ERA and FIP or ERA and XFIP and even ERA and expected ERA, if you just look at ERA and you compare it to those three other metrics, you can interpret and anticipate a lot of line moves that are coming. If you see a guy with a low ERA and then his xERA, his FIP, and his XFIP are all higher and significantly higher at that, like Overton's are, you can expect a line move against that guy. Yep. On the flip side, if he's got a high ERA with a lower xERA, lower FIP, lower XFIP than his ERA, then you're probably going to see money come in on that guy. So it's a very easy, very quick indicator to try and find some line value out there in the marketplace and get out in front of a number.
And so that was kind of be my next question, which is, look, I'm nowhere near like the day-to-day baseball handicapper like you and others are. Like, this is easily for me, as somebody who likes analytics, to punch up fan graphs, find these numbers, realize that Overton's probably going to get played against here today. Market moves in that direction. Like, has the market not accounted enough for stuff like this when it comes to these lines? Because you're right. Like, it's seemingly every time you find a situation like this, the line will move in that direction.
Right. Yeah. And this is something that probably started, I would say, maybe 6 to 7 years ago, where you would see what I call the ERA and FIP line move, which is, the low ERA, high FIP, high ERA, low FIP. That started happening maybe 6, 7 years ago. So I had to pivot. I had to adjust, kind of find different ways, different stats to dig into the market with. But it is something that takes place almost regularly across the board from influential bettors that bet overnight. Yep. Basically the modeling crowd, the people that have, spreadsheets and interpret data like what we're talking about. Those are people that are going to look at a guy like Overton and say, he cannot continue with a 159 ERA. It's not going to happen. Now, the degree of regression is what we're all worried about here, where it could happen in the sense that he gives up 8 runs today in 2 innings. Then all of a sudden his ERA goes from 159 to probably 5-something. Mm-hmm. It could be more gradual, where he just doesn't pitch well for 4, 5, 6 starts in a row. So we hope for the latter because we can keep fading that guy. But sometimes it is something that happens rather immediately, but it is something that's going to happen. So a lot of bettors are just going to keep betting on it over and over and over again until it really does.
So with the expected ERA, because this is a somewhat new one for me, how do you balance the difference between that and fielding independent? Because like a guy like Overton's a really good example, and we're going to talk about one later too, but 322 fielding independent and a 495 xERA is a very big difference.
It's a huge difference. And one of the things that xERA incorporates is a few years ago, StatCast data became publicly available. StatCast era began in 2015, but that's where you get stuff like exit velocity, where you get hard hit percentage, barrel rate, a lot of these things that actually have kind of forced me to believe a little bit more in ERA just because we can see the contact quality of pitchers giving up.
Yeah.
If he's giving up a lot of hard hit contact, that's why his ERA is high. So xERA actually uses in the formula things like hard hit rate, things like barrel percentage. So you look at Overton, his xERA is about 3 runs higher than his regular ERA. 52% of batted balls against him have been hit at least 95 miles per hour off the bat. Now, the average batting average is 464 on a batted ball of 95 plus miles per hour. So the idea here would be he's allowing a lot of hard contact. That's going to catch up with him sooner rather than later. So that's why his xERA is so much higher and why we saw that line move against him today, even though Plesac has not pitched well at all.
Yep.